I want to use this opportunity to share the story of my grandmother's sister, or what I know of it. I'm interested in her because she was a librarian in the New York Public Library. And I lived in New York City and used the public library, so of course I would have some interest. The story really starts with my great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Howard. She was heavily involved in women's issues during the Utah territorial period, and she had several descendants who were pioneers in that area. One of those descendants was her son, who played an important role in the suffrage movement. In fact, he was one of those who voted to give women the vote. But his daughter, Louise Howard, also had an important part to play. She was born and raised in Huntington, Utah. Here she is in an old photograph, standing in the middle, two other women in her life. The young girl is the baby of the family, Zina, and the woman on the right is her mother, Eliza Hill Howard. But she had some older brothers and sisters. And this is a photo that contains my grandmother, the little girl right in the middle, standing in the front, was my grandmother. This photo was taken short time before Louise was born. This is my grandmother as an adult. Her name was Eliza Amy Howard Staker after she got married. And she named one of her daughters after her sister, Louise. But both my grandma and her sister were born and raised in Huntington, one of the waste places, according to the tombstone of William Howard, who helped build it. William was a polygamist. This was one of his homes in Huntington. Louise's mother was his third wife. When she was growing up, Louise attended the Emory Stake Academy, which her father had helped found in Castledale. She was a studious child, and one Sunday evening program, she gave a reading called In the Children's Hospital. In 1912, she was the featured speaker in another program for the community, presenting a paper on heredity and environment. The next year, she went to Provo to finish her high school education. At that time, both high school and college students attended classes in the same building. And here she is with her roommates. She's the second from the right, wearing a long dark dress. And her roommates are all lined up in front of presumably the home where they lived in Provo. One of her classmates was quite famous. Alma W. Richards was a former farm boy from Parowan. He was the very first Utahn to win a gold medal in the Olympic Games in Stockholm in 1912. And he came back the following year to finish up his high school education. So he graduated with Louise. This is the entrance to the main building. It no longer exists. On the left-hand side of this page. On the right-hand side is one of the Founders' Day activities during 1913, a tug of war between the college students and the high school students. The high school students lost, of course, and a couple of them are in the water in this photograph. This was probably Louise's very first exposure to an academic library, something that would become very important in her life later on. There were 68 students in her high school class who graduated with her. There were 21 college students who graduated at the same time. 25 of the classmates of Louise were in the academic department, which I presume means that they planned to pursue further education. Louise was one of those 25. Apostle David O. McKay spoke at the graduation. He'd been serving as principal at the Weber Stake Academy in Ogden. But the following year, Louise's father died. And after that, she went back to Huntington to teach. We know she taught 6th grade the first year, but she taught for 2 years there, and she was also secretary in the Young Women's Association for the Huntington Ward. Later on, she went to Logan to continue her college education at the Utah State Agricultural College. She was there when the very first women's advisor was appointed by the university of the school. And she participated in a number of extracurricular activities. She and 2 other women students assisted in putting on the first Boys and Girls Club school for agriculture and home economics students from nearly every high school in Utah. She was also active in other ways. She joined a women's club called the Cirrhosis Society that was dedicated to literature and culture. Several decades later, it became the Alpha Chi Omega sorority. But while Louise was at Utah State, World War I called many of her classmates to the battlefield. And it wasn't too long after that that she moved to the big city, Seattle, Washington. Up there in the Northwest, she became involved in a movement called Chautauqua, an effort to bring culture throughout the entire United States. Theodore Roosevelt called it the most American thing in America. They would set up tents in different communities, and there would be lectures, sometimes drama, and sometimes music. Here's one of the songs.
Where are the boys of the old brigade who fought with us side by side? Shoulder to shoulder and blade to blade, they fought till they fell and died.
We would probably call that barbershop music nowadays. There's another song here that you might be more familiar with. But Louise would go around and as an advance agent to set up the different programs. And so she traveled throughout the Northwest and the coastal states. Here's a song that might seem more familiar to you.
God be with you till we meet again. By His countenance guide upon you. With His keep securely for you. God be with you till we meet again.
Okay, we know she was living in Seattle in 1920 because she was in the census there. She was a stenographer. That was her occupation. But it also says she was a student. And upon further research, I discovered that she was a student at the University of Washington. In fact, she got a job while she was studying science on campus. She was the 3rd assistant catalog librarian. Probably her first library job. Sometime between 1920 and 1930, she moved to New York, where she got a job in the library, the New York Public Library. The 1930 census has her living as a lodger with a couple of German immigrants, Otto and Anna. And her occupation says she's a librarian in the public library. This was the main library in Manhattan, but this is probably not where Louise worked because her home, her apartment, was in Washington Heights, which is in northern Manhattan, between the Hudson and Harlem rivers. And it was a growing area in New York City when Louise went there. In fact, the George Washington Bridge was newly constructed. It crossed the Hudson River between Washington Heights and Fort Lee, New Jersey. Today, it's the world's busiest motor vehicle bridge. But this is the library where Louise probably worked, the Washington Heights branch. It was completed in 1914, and Andrew Carnegie contributed funds for its construction. Louise lived in this building, most likely, with the German immigrant couple. And here's a little map showing where the apartment was and where the Washington Heights Library is. Louise lived in 545 Edgecombe Avenue. It was just a 3-minute walk around the corner to the Washington Heights Library. And each day she would pass a famous mansion, which happens to be the oldest home in New York City. It was built in 1765 for a British colonel, Roger Morris. He left it in 1776 when the Revolutionary War started. And George Washington moved in here the fall of 1776. From this home, he oversaw the Battle of Harlem Heights, which the Americans won, but George Washington had to retreat to north of the city shortly after that, and it was taken over as a headquarters for the British and Hessian armies until the end of the Revolutionary War. But it still exists, and Louise walked past there almost every time she went to work at the library. In 1968, she passed away. This was her obituary in the Emory County newspaper. It says that she also attended the University of Utah and Northwest University in Seattle. That's a small Christian college, but I haven't found any more information about those two stints of education for her yet. Someday maybe we'll find some more information about her studies there. After she died, her remains were brought back to Huntington, and she was buried in the Huntington Cemetery, where her parents are buried. Since she didn't have any children, her estate was divided up among her next of kin. And my dad got a little bit of money along with his brothers and sisters that came from her estate. But her greatest legacy was probably her groundbreaking move into education and the professional field at a time when most women didn't follow that path.